Question number one is, how to explain the passionate intensity that the writer of the sonnets has for Southampton? Is he the Tudor heir? Is he Shakespeare's lover? What do you think is the rationale for that? And question number two is, and of course I now at the end of the day have more questions than answers. Why is Southampton spared? What are your thoughts about that? And question number three is, why the negotiation that Oxford has to disappear in order to save Southampton's life? What's going on there? Why does he disappear so immediately?
Okay, so there's three questions about Southampton there. I don't know, perhaps we can start with Hank.
Okay, let me try that. I believe Southampton was held hostage in the Tower as the ticket to get Oxford to disappear. What I mean is, Shakespeare we've said all during the day that he did some very dangerous things, wrote some very dangerous things. And they were connected to people in the court such as Robert Cecil. That's the main figure. So imagine Cecil thinking, one of these days when everything's over and if I can get to be on the power behind the throne of James, Oxford's still there, still writing, still doing his thing, and connecting, and then outing me somehow as if he's my former brother-in-law wrote Richard III. You know he's writing about me, and my descendants are not going to be very happy. Burleigh gave Robert Cecil very strict plea on his deathbed to handle the succession for us, keep control. So this was part of the bargain to do that. Otherwise, he would have killed Southampton right away, perhaps. Why not? I don't see any other reason why Southampton would have been spared, unless you want to bring the Queen into it. But I believe that Cecil held all the power at that point. That's one thing. So the relationship of Oxford to Southampton deserves a full-day conference.
That's a really good answer, Hank. Claire, Paul, I'm just wondering if you have a response to that, why you think, well, particularly why was Southampton spared?
Let me just add, I tried to say that he linked Southampton uniquely to the pen name. Therefore, both he and the pen name have to disappear. They can't be one or the other.
Okay.
That's all.
Okay. Paul, Claire, do you have thoughts on that?
I think because they didn't need to execute Southampton. The idea was they had to get rid of Essex, and then you have to have enough bodies to prove it was serious, and then you want to have the minimum bloodshed possible, because remember, you're executing your family when you do this. Southampton is connected. People are pleading for his life. Cecil makes a big deal about he's one of the people pushing for sparing him. The Queen doesn't want to go out with a bloodbath. So I think, Danvers is basically the sacrifice for Southampton, I think.
If I can just, dialogue with you a moment, that could well be. The technical part of it is that once you're convicted of high treason like that, as Essex was, it was a very swift execution. And as Thomas Lee had already been executed, and we didn't mention that, but before the trial, Cecil really meant business, and he went on and executed the others, but he would have, in that time frame, executed Southampton first. There's nothing in the law, nothing in official.
Oh, he could. There's certainly, but it's the Queen who has to approve that execution. The other the missing piece in this puzzle is that the Essex people are not the only ones being executed. There's a number of Catholics who are very conspicuously executed, including Anne Lyne, an aged gentlewoman. So they're making the point. So there's two priests and Anne Lyne executed in the snow. And so the point there is to try and smear Essex with the idea of him being in league with Tyrone and the Pope.
Okay, thank you for that. Any other comments, Claire, or anyone else? No? Okay, so we have another question up there.
Why did the notoriously mean Queen give the Earl of Oxford £1,000, which is a heck of a lot of money in those days.
Yes.
So why did the Queen give Oxford?
Yeah.
Okay,
Well,
£1,000.
The Queen gave that grant, a yearly allowance or pension of £1,000 as part of a Secret Service kind of formula in 1586. And although perhaps the Anglo-Scottish War, Anglo-Spanish War, had not been officially declared, but kind of by 1584 it was in full swing. It started to be, and we knew they knew then the Armada was coming. The Earl, I believe, was a major player, a major voice behind many of these histories that the Queen's men, started by the Puritan Walsingham of all things, the Queen's Company, playing those histories that have those familiar names to people who know Shakespeare's plays. There were about 6 of them that were refashioned, unless Shakespeare's a total plagiarist, into Richard II, Richard III, King John, things like that. That Queen's Men was very much in service of rousing patriotic feeling, warning against civil war, creating a national identity, and I believe that the same thing that the United States, for example, did in World War I or World War II. We had an Office of Stars and Stripes newspaper, and in our great filmmakers in World War II came in to help with patriotic films. It's the same sort of thing. It's not to demean the artists who are doing this or their work. It's that it was in service of a great cause. England would have been buried, and we wouldn't be here speaking English anyway.
Thanks, Hank. Any other thoughts on that? Or I've got a couple of questions here. Yeah. First of all, here, and then there.
My question, it carries on from the last one about the enormous sum of money that was given to Oxford, which went on into James's reign, as we know. And I think the other question that follows from that is, how on earth did he keep his head? Although he was writing plays for the good of the Tudors early on, his plays increasingly became satires on people like Robert and William Cecil and co. And they must have known this. I'm just slightly surprised that he got away with it.
Yes, it would be surprising unless you had a queen who really encouraged the theater, encouraged him to write, and knew him from very early, early time, when he was 11 or 12, right? So his father had players. She loved it at court. She loved the satire. She loved all that stuff.
But she didn't love people writing about the succession, and if she thought Richard II was about her, which we know she did, if she knew Oxford was the author, surely that's a really big problem. I mean, Essex was her favourite, but she did get his head cut off in the end. So if she knew that Oxford was the author, I mean, do you argue that the Queen knew that Oxford was Shakespeare?
From day one.
Then I don't know how he would get away with the scurrilous things he was writing about.
Well, the deposition scene was not there probably in 1597 or 8.
But the very playing of the play is seen as very problematic on the eve of the Essex Rebellion. If the Queen thought that was the Earl of Oxford that had written that, surely he should have been in the dock.
He sure should have been, right. But he was the Earl of Oxford, and she had always protected him.
But Essex was the Earl of Essex, and she had treated him extremely favourably.
That's very different, though.
Okay, we have another question up there. Up there, please, Julia.
Hi, my question is for Claire. I really enjoyed your close analysis of Venus and Adonis and Lucrece, but the big question that sprang to my mind was if you feel that the reason for the popularity was the political satire, and if that was evident to contemporaries, how come it was they were published and republished and weren't censored or banned?
Very difficult saying. I don't think I can give an answer, except that Annabel Patterson, great 16th century scholar, wrote that all 16th century literature was a way around censorship. And if if everything was, and if the situation was actually being discussed much more openly than we think, it wasn't just one or two daring people stepping over the line covertly, but it was a game. Drayton, Chapman, Daniel, the whole lot, Lodge, were all playing this way and that. Pretty exhausting, actually, for certainly the ecclesiastical censors to follow. And if it was done amusingly, delicately enough, the enjoyment that you got out of reading a brilliant New Statesman article outweighed the possible subversion. So that's my answer.
The Archbishop, it was unusual for Catherine Duncan-Jones, so it's very unusual that the Archbishop of Canterbury licensed Venus and Adonis. So that's quite extraordinary, and it's the first publication by this new name, and it was given a license by the Archbishop of Canterbury. So he must have gone through it with a fine-tooth comb and managed to find, nothing. It's so beautifully hidden in kind of the classical story, and so it's completely defensible. So you can say, well, no, people might be reading that into it, but it's certainly not what I wrote. I think it's
absolutely
it's so well hidden. It's so cleverly hidden.
So well hidden that scholars now do think it was a reproach to Southampton. It's dedicated to the foolish young man who rejected his guardian's choice of marriage partner. And you can read it entirely that way. And the subtlety and beauty of Shakespeare's writing is, I think, one element in his repeated escape. I mean, we heard in the wonderful reading of Richard II, which I really thought was brilliant, how the Queen could have empathised with that scene. Were with the deposed monarch. And it's a very clever play because as you read it, you see Richard at first riding for a fall. As soon as he starts to fall, Shakespeare switches your sympathy to Richard. And suddenly the problematic person is Bolingbroke. And sure enough, in the next play, Bolingbroke is in deep trouble. And there's a retrospective remark saying, what happened to Richard? That sweet, lovely rose, which is certainly not. Yeah. So, his brilliance in playing both sides is what gets him through. And also, I think, because of his brilliance, he had great patrons. We don't know who they are. They could have been the Windsors, it could have been the Worcesters, they could have been all sorts of people. We don't know. There's an awful lot we don't know. We can't resist playing with the tiny number of pieces that we do know. We know Southampton, etc. So we put them everywhere. But there are countless more personalities that we don't know about.
Might add two things to this. Richard II is also a cautionary tale, instructional. After all, the king is not set free after he deposes and gives his crown away. He's put in prison, as we heard. And then he's killed by accident. I thought the king ordered me. But see what happens when you do this. So you're right. I mean, it was very clever. The other thing about Venus and Adonis is a long passage describing the only painting of Titian that has the bonnet on it of Venus and Adonis. And it comes from Titian's house where it was. And that work has been done by very good work here. By many people, and was in Great Oxford, and so on. And that tells us that we believe that Oxford came back from Italy and wrote that first version of that poem about himself and the Queen but he wrote it in maybe the latter half of the 1570s. He came home in 1576. Now, that would have then been revised. And so whatever, we're not necessarily in conflict there. It's just that's a thing that's a marker for almost the author as someone who had seen that painting in Venice.
Okay, thank you.
Setting Oxford and all the other candidates aside, I'd like to know what Professor Hammer and then the rest of the panel think about how did the Stratford man survive politically the last decade of the reign?
I suspect he's not as much in danger as he might think. I don't think Shakespeare is Oxford, but you can make a case. We have to remember that for instance, just around the Rising, right? So there was the performance on the 7th of February. His company had previously been at court for on the 6th of January, and then they perform on the eve of Essex's execution. And I think John Guy's made the point that almost certainly Elizabeth made her final decision about Essex while watching a Shakespeare play. So and the fact that the authorities don't seem to really care too much about investigating the play, even though Bacon brings it into his declaration, it's just, to me, suggests that because Shakespeare is so important to us, we think Shakespeare, right? That is a name to conjure with, to put it mildly. But the authorities at the time, the contemporaries, didn't quite see it that way. So I'm not sure I'm really answering your question. I'm kind of walking around.
Lesser poets got a lot of worse trouble in this period.
Well, yes, but they're partly because they were unwise enough to be too obvious about what they're doing. So Ben Jonson gets in trouble, Nash gets in trouble. The thing about Shakespeare is he's brilliant at being able to do things deniably, I think. So when, like in Henry VIII, when he says things that are problematic, it's almost directly out of Holinshed. So you can say, I just took it out of Holinshed. So I think he's seen what's happened to Marlowe. He's seeing what's happening to other people, and I think he's quite good at preemptively deflecting that.
Okay. Anyone else want to chip in there? No?
I agree. I mean, I agree with the deniability, and I think he's much cleverer at taking both sides. He exactly as you described, Claire. He'll show us the good and the bad in almost everybody, and certainly in rulers. I was very interested actually in Greg's graphic of the history plays that stop. And there's Essex, and then, no more history plays. And then there's Henry VIII. Well, Henry VIII, supposedly half written by Fletcher, I have long thought this could very easily be, it's a partly written play that is then abandoned and Fletcher finishes it.
I do, yeah.
Right? So it's not that it's written then, it was written when he was still doing the history plays, and then it's like, do you know what, history plays? Possibly too dangerous, and actually, once the succession has happened, not relevant anymore, and Essex, the whole Essex debacle makes it very clear that actually stay well away, and the imprisonment of Hayward as well for writing the Henry IV book. So he stops with the history plays and he moves on to other things, and it takes a lot more care in the way that he's expressing his concern about regimes and steps away from history.
I'd like to add something. An example of how Shakespeare dealt with the Queen in terms of whether there's treason and so on in the play. I gave an example of that. He had close access to the Queen. He knew her very intimately. She knew him. And he was able to swerve things away by saying, well, the play is based on these sources and so on. So I gave an example of that. So I hope that answered the question. And also the thing about these sonnets, everyone's been talked about today, actually fit the two brothers, Anthony and Francis Bacon, to a T. And for them it's devastating, the Essex thing. Francis Bacon was ordered by the Queen to play his role. He didn't want to. He objected strongly, but he had to. He's the Queen's counsel, and he had promised to obey the Queen. And he had made that clear to Essex beforehand. He'd have to do, but it devastated him all the same. He really was ghastly for him. As for Anthony Bacon, he was probably in love with Essex. He was that way inclined, and he died very, very quickly after Essex was executed, having apparently, according to letter, having been trying to find out ways to prove Essex was actually innocent of all the charges as they came up, as the Queen and Cecil had formed them. They weren't quite the same, but in the end he died in mysterious circumstances. Some people think he committed suicide, but I find it also interesting that the day after his servant also died mysteriously. So I think it could have been poison. but from the Cecils, because Robert Cecil had vowed to do exactly that to the Bacon and Essex. So I think it is. I think the sonnets are really, really grieving about it. I think the third poem, Shakespeare poem, the Phoenix and Adonis. The Phoenix and Turtle, is it's just an outburst of paean. You know, at the loss of Essex and Anthony. Anthony was known as the Phoenix. Writers from abroad used to hail him as the Phoenix of poetry, and so on. So he was known as the Phoenix, and they both died suddenly like that because of this ghastly thing that happened. It's all there. It's all there.
Okay, thank you for that, Peter. Julia, I think you have a question, and then behind you as well.
A question for the panel. Something that hasn't been mentioned, which normally is mentioned in this context, is the extraordinary conversation between the antiquarian Lambarde and the Queen, which took place in August 1601. And I wonder if, when she says, "I am Richard II, know ye not that?" And some rather other interesting things. I wonder if anyone, perhaps Paul, would start with a comment on that.
Okay, we were talking about this before. Lambarde talks with Elizabeth when he's presenting her with a kind of a catalogue to records from the Tower. He'd been appointed as the kind of archivist there at the beginning of the year. And the story goes that she picks on a reference to documents from Richard II's reign, and she makes this comment. So I guess part of it is it's not clear to me that Richard II necessarily is the play. It could be Hayward's book. That's a possibility, because that is the thing that's been, they've tried to use, that's the thing that they've really tried to use for treason against Essex. The other thing is this thing about 40 times in the streets. This is the notes that survive are not explicit, they're not clear, so we have to try and work out what the heck they mean. I think what's going on in London at the time is there are street protests going on by former Essexians. There is certainly a description of these people wearing nettles and tawny ribbons and threatening, if you've killed our master, why don't you kill us? Do something about it. And of course, the writer of the letter says no one's prepared to take them on. So I think there's that. There is Harrington talks about the Queen, kind of the madcaps and stuff, and the Queen and her rusty sword and all of that. So I suspect Elizabeth is hearing about what's going on in the streets of London. There is instability over the summer, and maybe there's a sense that the Richard II figure, whether it's from the play or from Hayward's book or just more generically, she's seeing this as basically disturbance for her reign.
And of course it goes on, doesn't it, to a remark about Essex, which Lambarde goes, it didn't know what to say.
Exactly, ungrateful.
Because, this is to do with an ungrateful servant, and we all know who he is. But to go back to perhaps a little bit to the previous question, but connected with that, why the Queen could say, I am Richard II, no, you're not that, is Richard II was, as well as in the conference of the succession, there he is as a king ripe for abdication, which he'd abdicated, actually. The reason was he was a beautiful, cultivated, misled young man, and the evil counsellors were what brought him down. He was the paradigm of a monarch who could have been better, but evil counsellors got to him. And Shakespeare's very careful to put them backstage. They're just called Bushy, Bagot and Green, and they have no character or anything. They're just little walk-on parts. Whereas Marlowe in Edward II, absolutely the same story, is far too explicit about the father and son evil counsellors, the Spencers, who mislead Edward II. And I think that's what did for Marlowe, really. Marlowe went much too far. It was crude compared with Shakespeare. And so Shakespeare carefully puts them backstage, but everybody knew that Richard II was the victim of evil counsellors, and so the Queen could step into that role. So it's not me.
Yeah, so I guess the other thing is I dare bring up the Dolman book, because Richard II features in that book, and crucially the argument that the writer or writers plural uses is that on the basis of that the monarchy should be elective, which is seen as a gross political heresy.
Although
in the
these
1590s.
ideas have been swilling around on the continent,
yes,
and
yes,
particularly
yes.
among Protestants,
Yes.
that, and it's rather a fine argument in that book that in the last resort, England is, what do we call it, an elective monarchy, I think, that the balance between Parliament and the Crown, even then, Dolman is saying, we have, the people have the final say. And if we have a very unjust king, very unjust monarch, what should we do? And it asks that question, not in a polemical way, I think. It explores it with lots of sort of analogies from English history and scriptural history. It's a very interesting book. I recommend it.
Fletcher's interesting, actually, because he has a connection to the Essex Rebellion.
Who is this?
John Fletcher, who
Yes.
co-wrote Henry VIII. So Fletcher's father, I think, died in 1593. And Fletcher's uncle took part in the Essex Rebellion. And something happened to him. Now, I'm not sure if he was executed.
No. He's caught up in it because this is Giles Fletcher.
Giles Fletcher.
Right. So he is a City of London official, and he's one of the people that Cuff's targeting. Actually, Temple's the one sent to him, I think. So he's kind of caught up in this idea of to what extent are the London authorities pro-Essex, and he's kind of trying to say, oh no. But he's had a difficult time because he was left dealing with all his brother's children, all the late bishop's children, and all the debts and stuff.
Always good to have a historian in the room. Talks about facts, not fantasies. Some more facts. So Southampton was Neville's best friend. It's documentary evidence. When Neville's in the Tower, he's writing documents for Neville. I mean, you can go and look at them in the British Library. Fletcher, his plays, he left behind a play, A King and No King, dedicated to Henry Neville. I think it's really crucial to go, okay, what do the documents tell us, as opposed to what do I fantasize from the plays? We can all do that thing of watching the play and then projecting it back onto history. But actually there is documentary evidence. There's more of it. There's lots of documents that have not been read. There's a whole whole sheaf of documents in Italian in Neville's papers that no one's looked at.
Very choice.
I mean, it's really fascinating.
Okay.
But to go from the documents, from the evidence outwards.
Thank you. We've got time for one more question, and then we'll have to wrap up. So.
But I just wonder how James I's Queen could be openly Catholic. Why wasn't that a problem?
Well, you could. Well, anyone else want to answer this? But it's perfectly okay to be Catholic above a certain rank. There were Catholic courtiers, the Howards. The Earl of Worcester was Catholic. If you were, I'm afraid, if you were a member of the aristocracy, you could kind of get away with it, provided you played the game right. So Anne of Denmark was allowed a private chapel, I think, and there are questions over the depth and extent of her Catholicism, which I'm sure Paul Hammer can help us out with. But it was only further down the social rank that it was absolutely impossible. But you could go to Mass at the Spanish Embassy, just north of where Shakespeare was living, Silver Street, a few steps up, and you were in the Spanish Embassy. Lots of people took that risk. Yeah. But
Okay, so I think we're going to have to wrap it up there. It's been a very full day.